Sometimes the kindest hearts suffer the cruelest fates. When good people are hurt by those who should protect them, we all feel that familiar ache of injustice burning in our chest. Maeryn was a village healer who spent her life caring for others. After her husband died, she walked alone through winter nights to tend the sick and deliver babies. Everyone knew her gentle spirit. But one bitter evening, desperate men decided to hurt her, breaking her arm and leaving her bleeding in the snow. They thought no one would come for a lonely widow. They were wrong. Deep in the ancient forest, something stirred when her blood touched the frozen ground. Varrik, the last vampire, had sworn an oath centuries ago to protect those who showed mercy. What he did to her attackers became legend. But was awakening this ancient protector truly a blessing? Or had Maeryn's suffering unleashed something far more dangerous? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Ravenhollow, nestled in a valley where winter arrived early and stayed late, as if the surrounding mountains conspired to trap the cold within their stone embrace. Ancient pines crowded the slopes like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow that rarely melted completely, even in the brief summer months. The forest pressed close to the village edges, so near that on moonless nights the darkness between the trees seemed to breathe. Maeryn Aldriksdottir had called this place home for 43 years, 20 of them as a widow. Her cottage sat on the village's eastern edge, close enough to the forest that she could gather herbs by moonlight, yet near enough to the main square that desperate mothers could find her when their children burned with fever. The house itself bore the marks of careful tending, shutters painted annually in deep green, a roof that never leaked, and windows that caught the morning light like welcoming eyes. Inside, dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the rafters, filling the air with the mingled scents of lavender, sage, and winter mint. Clay pots lined wooden shelves, each labelled in her precise script, with remedies for everything from headaches to heartbreak. A large wooden table dominated the main room, its surface worn smooth by years of mixing medicines and delivering babies. The fireplace crackled constantly during winter months, not just for warmth, but because many of her preparations required gentle heat to release their healing properties. This morning, like every morning for the past 2 decades, Maeryn began her day by touching the silver ring that hung from a thin chain around her neck. She no longer wore her wedding band on her finger. Hands that delivered babies and cleaned wounds needed to move freely, but she kept Aldrik close to her heart. The ring had been his grandfather's, then his father's, then his. Simple silver, unadorned, save for the tiny inscription inside that read, "Till death and beyond." Aldrik had been the village blacksmith, a man whose hands could shape iron into delicate hinges for jewelry boxes or powerful tools for clearing land. His death had been sudden, a mine collapse when he'd gone to help repair equipment. The rescue had taken 3 days, and by then the injuries were too severe for even Maeryn's considerable skills. She'd held his hand as he died, promising to continue caring for their people, to be strong enough for both of them. That promise had shaped every day since. Her morning routine never varied. First, check the fire, and add wood if needed. Second, prepare the bitter tea that kept her joints moving freely despite the damp cold. Third, review her mental list of patients and their needs. Today, like most days, the list was long. Young Isla Thornwick would need another visit. The girl's first baby was due any day, and first births often surprised new mothers with their intensity. Isla's husband worked the timber crews, gone for weeks at a time, leaving her alone with only her mother-in-law for company. Maeryn had been making daily visits, teaching breathing techniques and offering reassurance. Old Henrik's cough had worsened since the last snowfall. The man was proud to a fault, insisting he could manage with just the basic tonics, but Maeryn suspected lung fever building beneath his stubborn exterior. She would need to convince him to accept stronger medicine before the infection spread too deep to fight. Then there was little Marcus, barely 6 years old, whose arm had been twisted badly when his older brothers were roughhousing. The bone had set well, but the boy needed exercises to regain full movement. His mother, Gwen, often forgot the daily stretching routine, overwhelmed with 3 other children and a husband who drank more than he worked. The mental list continued: Widow Petra's arthritis, Miller Thompson's infected cut, and at least a dozen others who would need attention before the week ended. Each person carried not just physical ailments, but emotional burdens that often proved equally important to address. Maeryn had learned long ago that healing required understanding the whole person, not just their symptoms. After breaking her fast with thick porridge and preserved berries, she gathered her supplies. The leather satchel had been Aldrich's creation, designed specifically for her work with multiple compartments for different types of remedies. He'd crafted it during the first year of their marriage, when he'd realized that her calling extended far beyond their own household. The satchel held small clay pots of salves, packets of dried herbs wrapped in oiled cloth, rolls of clean linen for bandaging, and a few precious vials of stronger medicines she'd learned to make from her own mother. Everything had its place, organized by urgency and frequency of use. Her first stop would be to check on Isla, then visit Henrik, and finally make rounds to several families with minor ailments. If time allowed, she planned to visit the herb-gathering spot near the forest edge before darkness fell. The recent cold snap had actually improved the potency of certain winter plants, making them more effective for treating lung complaints. The walk to Isla's cottage took her through the village centre, where morning life slowly stirred to activity. Baker Willem was already preparing the day's bread, sending warm, yeast-scented air through his doorway. The aroma mingled with wood smoke from a dozen chimneys, and the sharper scent of metal from the blacksmith shop where Aldrich's apprentice, now master of the forge, continued the work. People greeted her with warm nods and respectful words. "Good morning, Healer Maeryn." "Blessings on your day, Maeryn. Thank you again for helping our Sarah last week." The acknowledgements came naturally, part of the village rhythm she'd known since childhood. But lately, she'd noticed subtle changes in those greetings. Where once they held simple appreciation, now she caught hints of concern, even pity. The villagers had begun looking at her differently since she'd turned 40, especially after the last hard winter, when food had run low and tempers had grown short. A woman alone, they whispered, needed protection she couldn't provide for herself. The concern wasn't entirely misplaced. The village had changed since her youth. Where once families supported each other through difficult times, desperation had begun creating divisions. The younger men, especially those who'd married into families with little land, showed increasing resentment toward anyone who seemed more secure. Gareth Morrison embodied this new bitterness. Once a reasonably pleasant man who'd married the miller's daughter, he'd grown surly as failed harvests and bad business decisions mounted his debts. He'd taken to gathering with others like him, Brom Fletcher and young Cale Darren, drinking away their frustrations and muttering about unfairness. Maeryn had treated Gareth's children for various ailments, and had never asked payment when his family couldn't afford her usual modest fees. But gratitude had slowly soured into resentment, as if her willingness to help without payment somehow highlighted his inability to provide. Elder Tomas had warned her about this shift in village dynamics. As the eldest person in Ravenhollow and keeper of community memory, he understood how economic pressure could transform decent people into desperate ones. Hungry men do foolish things, he'd told her recently. They need someone to blame for their troubles, and kindness can seem like judgment when a man's pride is wounded. She'd reached Isla's cottage, where the young woman answered the door with one hand, supporting her heavily pregnant belly. "Oh, Maeryn, perfect timing. I've been having tightening since before dawn, and Mother Thornwick has gone to help her sister with some family trouble." The next several hours passed in the familiar rhythm of midwifery, false labour, as Maeryn had suspected, but strong enough to frighten a first-time's mother. She taught Isla breathing exercises, prepared a calming tea, and stayed until the contractions eased completely. "The baby will come when ready," she assured the young woman. "Your body is simply practicing for the real event. When true labour begins, you'll know the difference." From Isla's cottage, she made her way to Henrik's dwelling, a tidy cabin where the old man lived alone since his wife's death 3 years prior. She found him sitting by his fire, the harsh sound of his cough echoing off the walls. "Let me listen to your chest," she said, without preamble. Henrik was too practical for lengthy social conversation when illness was involved. The examination confirmed her fears. The infection had spread deeper into his lungs, and his fever had risen since her last visit. She prepared a strong antibiotic tonic from her supplies, mixing willow bark extract with honey and adding a tincture that would help loosen the congestion. "Drink this 3 times daily, and I'll be back tomorrow with more," she instructed. "No working outside until the fever breaks completely." Henrik nodded, understanding the seriousness in her tone. "You're a blessing to this village, Maeryn. Don't know what we'd do without you." The comment warmed her heart, but also reminded her of the growing isolation she felt. Being essential to everyone's well-being created a strange loneliness. People needed her skills, but few sought her companionship. She was the healer, set apart by her knowledge and responsibility. As evening approached, she made her way toward the forest edge, where the best winter mint grew. The herb was crucial for treating lung complaints like Henrik's, and her supply was running low. The gathering spot lay perhaps half a mile from the village, near a small clearing where an ancient standing stone marked what local legend claimed was once sacred ground. The forest felt different as twilight deepened. Where morning brought familiar bird calls and the rustle of small creatures, evening silence pressed close with an almost tangible weight. The snow crunched under her feet with each step, the only sound in the profound quiet. She'd always felt comfortable in these woods, even alone. Unlike many villagers who hurried through the trees as quickly as possible, Maeryn found peace among the ancient pines. They'd witnessed generations of healers before her, and she often felt their presence as a comforting continuity. Tonight, however, something felt different. The silence seemed deeper, more watchful, as if the forest itself held its breath in anticipation. She paused several times, turning to look behind her, but saw only snow-laden branches and the familiar patterns of shadow and moonlight. Near the standing stone, she found the winter mint she sought, its hardy leaves still potent despite the cold. As she gathered the herb carefully, leaving enough for the plant to recover, she became aware of an odd warmth in the air around the ancient marker. The stone itself seemed to radiate heat, though logic suggested frozen granite should be ice-cold. She reached out to touch the carved surface, tracing the weathered symbols that predated village memory. The moment her fingers contacted stone, a strange vibration seemed to pulse through her hand, like the echo of a heartbeat that had slept for centuries. Later she would remember this moment as the beginning, not of the violence that would follow, but of something far older stirring in response to changes yet to come. The ancient stone had witnessed oaths sworn and bonds forged long before her village existed, and those promises had patient ways of keeping themselves. For now, though, she simply gathered her herbs and made her way home, carrying the winter mint that would help Henrik breathe easier, and unaware that her own breath had just awakened something that had been waiting in the darkness for longer than living memory could recall. The cottage welcomed her with warmth and the familiar sense of home. She hung her cloak by the fire, prepared a simple supper, and settled into her evening routine of preparing medicines for tomorrow's visits. Outside, wind began to pick up, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling past her windows. In the depths of the forest, something ancient turned in its sleep, responding to a touch it had felt on stone and a presence it had sworn long ago to protect. But Maeryn, focused on grinding herbs and mixing tonics, noticed only that the fire seemed to burn more brightly tonight, and her cottage felt more secure than usual against the winter darkness pressing at her door. 3 nights after touching the ancient stone, Maeryn ventured into the forest again. Henrik's condition had worsened despite her treatments, and she needed fresh bloodroot, a rare herb that grew only in the deepest part of the woods, near the old ruins that predated the village by centuries. The temperature had dropped further, turning her breath to visible clouds and making the snow crunch like broken glass beneath her boots. She'd wrapped herself in Aldrich's old winter cloak, the wool still holding faint traces of his scent after all these years. The familiar comfort gave her courage for the longer journey ahead. Bloodroot required careful harvesting under moonlight to maintain its potency. The herb's crimson sap could break even the most stubborn lung fever, but only if gathered at the proper time and prepared immediately. Henrik didn't have days to wait for the next gathering opportunity. She followed a deer trail that wound deeper into the forest than her usual routes. The path was barely visible under fresh snowfall, marked more by the spaces between trees than any clear track. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most of the moonlight, creating a cathedral of shadow and silver. The standing stone she'd touched 3 nights before glowed faintly as she passed it, though she attributed the phenomenon to moonlight reflecting off ice crystals. She paused only long enough to leave a small offering of bread crumbs, an old custom her mother had taught her for safe passage through sacred places. 20 minutes later, she reached the ruins where bloodroot grew. Stone foundations jutted from the snow like broken teeth, remnants of structures so old that even Elder Tomas claimed no knowledge of their original purpose. Local legends suggested various possibilities: a temple, a fortress, a gathering place for ancient rituals. But time had erased any definitive answers. The bloodroot thrived among these ruins, as if drawing sustenance from whatever power had once consecrated this ground. She found several healthy plants and began the delicate process of harvesting their roots without disturbing the main growth. The work required concentration. Bloodroot was temperamental. Handled roughly, it would lose its healing properties and become merely another wild plant. She used a special silver blade that had belonged to her mother, cutting with surgical precision while whispering the old words that honored the plant's sacrifice. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear the footsteps until they were quite close. Well, well, the village healer, all alone in the dark woods. Maeryn looked up to find Gareth Morrison emerging from behind a large pine, followed closely by Brom Fletcher and young Cale Darren. The 3 men had clearly been drinking. She could smell the sour reek of cheap ale from several feet away. Their faces showed the false courage that alcohol often provided to weak men. "Good evening, Gareth," she said calmly, continuing her work. "I hope your family is well." "My family's hungry," he replied, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "My children ask why they can't have meat for supper, while the healer walks around with silver tools and warm cloaks." She finished cutting the bloodroot and placed it carefully in her gathering pouch before standing to face them properly. "If your children need food, you know I would never turn them away. I've helped your family many times without asking for payment." "Charity," Brom spat. "Always charity from the wealthy widow. Makes you feel good about yourself, doesn't it?" The accusation stung because it was so unfair. Maeryn had never displayed her modest savings, never flaunted anything over her neighbours. Her cottage was comfortable but simple, her clothing practical rather than fine. The only valuable items she owned were her medical tools, necessary for her work. "I don't understand what you want from me," she said, maintaining her composure despite growing unease. 3 men against 1 woman, far from help, with darkness falling. Even a healer recognized dangerous situations. "What we want," Gareth said, moving closer, "is what you've got hidden away in that cottage. Silver tools, herb stores worth good coin, whatever money you've saved from 20 years of playing saint." "I have little money," she replied truthfully. "Most of what I have goes back into supplies and medicines for the village." "Liar," Kyle whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. The youngest of the 3, he seemed more frightened than angry, perhaps beginning to realize the seriousness of what they contemplated. Gareth pulled a crude knife from his belt, a farming tool sharpened to a rough edge. "Here's what's going to happen, healer. You're going to come with us back to your cottage, and you're going to give us what we need to feed our families. Consider it payment for all the times you've made us feel small with your generous help." "I won't resist if you truly need food," Maeryn said carefully. "But this isn't the way to solve your problems. Taking from others won't heal whatever's eating at your hearts." The words seemed to enrage rather than calm him. "Don't you dare preach to us. Don't you dare stand there in your warm cloak with your silver tools and lecture us about our hearts." He lunged forward, grabbing her arm with enough force to make her cry out. The sudden violence shattered any pretense that this was merely desperate men seeking help. This was something darker, resentment and humiliation curdling into cruelty. "Please," she said, trying to pull away. "You're hurting me." "Good," Brom growled. "Time someone brought you down to earth." They began dragging her toward the path, but she stumbled over one of the ancient foundation stones, falling hard onto her knees. The bloodroot scattered from her gathering pouch, its precious sap staining the snow like drops of blood. When she tried to recover the herb, Gareth kicked her hands away. "Leave it. You won't be needing healing plants where you're going." The threat was clear enough to spark real terror. These men weren't planning to rob her and leave her alive. They'd crossed a line in their minds, transformed her from neighbor to enemy, and enemies could be eliminated. She tried to run then, breaking free from Brom's grip and stumbling toward the deeper forest. But 3 men, even drunk ones, could move faster than a woman in heavy winter clothing. They caught her within a dozen steps. The beating that followed was methodical, rather than frenzied. Gareth seemed to take pleasure in each blow, as if years of swallowed pride and wounded masculinity finally found expression through violence. He broke her left arm with a deliberate strike from a fallen branch, smiling when she screamed. Brom held her while Gareth worked, occasionally adding his own kicks to her ribs and back. Kyle stood apart, increasingly pale, but lacking the courage to intervene. "This is what happens to people who think they're better than us," Gareth panted between strikes. "This is what happens when you make a man feel small in front of his children." When they were finished, she lay bleeding in the snow, her arm twisted at an unnatural angle, her ribs screaming with each breath. They stood over her, breathing heavily from their exertion. Should we? Kyle began, but Gareth cut him off. She's done. Leave her for the wolves. They walked away without looking back, their footsteps fading into the forest silence. Maeryn tried to call after them, not for mercy, but for understanding. What had she done to deserve such hatred? But her voice emerged as barely a whisper, lost in the vast indifference of the winter night. She lay there, as blood seeped from her wounds into the ancient ground, mixing with spilled bloodroot sap to create patterns that seemed almost deliberately formed. The pain was overwhelming, but worse was the sense of profound betrayal. These were people she'd helped, children she'd delivered, families she'd cared for through illness and injury. As her blood touched the earth near the old ruins, something stirred deep beneath the frozen ground, in chambers carved from living rock, where no human foot had walked for 3 centuries. Silver eyes opened in the darkness. The binding stone in the forest depths began to crack, responding to blood spilled in violence against one who had shown mercy to all. Ancient oaths stirred to wakefulness, and promises made to protect the innocent began to remember their power. Varrik, who had slumbered since the last healer died in these woods, felt the call singing through his bones. Someone had shed innocent blood on consecrated ground. Someone had hurt a protector of life itself. The last alpha vampire rose from his long sleep, and the hunt began. In the ruins, Maeryn struggled to remain conscious, unaware that her suffering had awakened something that would make her attacker's cruelty seem like children's games compared to the justice that was coming for them. Dawn brought no relief from the cold, only pale light filtering through clouds heavy with the promise of more snow. Maeryn had somehow managed to drag herself from the ruins to a fallen log, where she huddled through the endless night, her broken arm cradled against her chest. Every breath sent sharp pain through her ribs, and dried blood cracked on her face when she moved. She might have died there, if not for young Willem the baker's son, who came seeking winter berries for his mother's preserves. The boy found her just as consciousness threatened to slip away entirely, and his terrified shouts brought help, running from the village. Elder Thomas arrived first, despite his 70 years moving faster through the snow than men half his age. He took one look at Maeryn's condition and began issuing orders with the authority of someone accustomed to crisis. "Willem, run for Isla. Tell her to bring clean linens and boiling water. Marcus, fetch Henrik if he can stand, and get whoever else isn't too. Sick to help. We need to get her to shelter immediately." They fashioned a stretcher from pine branches and Tomas's cloak, moving her as gently as possible back to her cottage. Each jostle sent fire through her broken bones, but she bit back cries that would only distress her rescuers. Her cottage became a center of worried activity as villagers gathered to help their healer. Isla, despite her advanced pregnancy, took charge of cleaning wounds and setting the broken arm. Henrik, still weak from his lung fever, but determined to repay her care, kept the fire blazing and prepared broths to restore her strength. "Who did this to you?" Thomas asked gently, once her injuries were stabilized, and she could speak without gasping. Maeryn hesitated. Naming her attackers would bring the villagers' justice down on them, and despite their cruelty, she understood the desperation that drove them. "I fell," she whispered, "among the ruins. The stones were icy." Tomas's weathered face showed he didn't believe her for a moment. "Stones don't grab a woman's arm and break it with malice, child. These are the marks of deliberate violence." But she refused to say more, and after a while, he stopped pressing for details. Elder Thomas had lived long enough to recognize when someone needed time to process trauma before sharing its full weight. Over the following days, as Maeryn slowly healed, strange reports began filtering through the village. Hunters spoke of tracks in the snow that made no sense. Sometimes human footprints that appeared and vanished without explanation, sometimes marks like nothing they'd ever seen. Old Henrik claimed he'd heard howling in the night that didn't sound like any wolf he knew. Too intelligent, he told anyone who would listen. Too purposeful, like something calling for revenge. The livestock grew restless, huddling together in their shelters and refusing to graze near the forest edge. Chickens stopped laying, and the village dogs whined continuously, hackles raised at sounds only they could hear. Thomas spent long hours in his cottage, studying the ancient chronicle book that had been in his family for generations. The leather-bound volume contained village history, genealogies, and fragments of much older stories that predated Ravenhollow itself. He'd always dismissed the older entries as folklore, tales of forest guardians and supernatural protectors that belonged more to legend than history. But recent events made him reconsider stories he'd thought were merely colourful mythology. One passage, written in his great-grandfather's careful script, described an entity that slept in the deep forest, but could be awakened by innocent blood spilled on consecrated ground. The being was called a life ward, sworn to protect those who healed and helped others. The description that followed sent chills down Thomas's spine. Should such a guardian wake, it will hunt those who shed innocent blood until justice is satisfied. The here guilty will know no rest, no peace, no safety, until their debt is paid in full. He'd read this passage dozens of times over the years, always assuming it was poetic metaphor rather than literal warning. Now, with strange tracks appearing nightly and Maeryn refusing to name her attackers, he wondered if his ancestors had preserved more than folklore. 3 men in the village had grown increasingly agitated since the night Maeryn was attacked. Gareth Morrison jumped at shadows and snapped at his family over minor irritations. Brom Fletcher had taken to drinking even more heavily, muttering about watching eyes and whispered threats. Young Cale Darren looked hollow-eyed and haunted, flinching whenever anyone spoke to him directly. Their wives noticed the changes, but attributed them to winter stress and economic hardship. None suspected their husbands had committed violence against the woman who'd delivered their children and tended their illnesses. Meanwhile, Maeryn's cottage had become an informal gathering place for villagers seeking to help their injured healer. People brought food, offered to tend her fire, and shared news that might lift her spirits. The outpouring of support touched her deeply, even as physical pain made concentration difficult. Isla visited daily, her pregnancy now so advanced that she moved carefully to avoid premature labor. "The baby's been restless since the night you were hurt," she confided, kicking and turning like it senses something wrong in the world. "Babies are sensitive to their mother's emotions," Maeryn replied, though privately she wondered if there might be truth to the girl's instincts. Her own dreams had been vivid and strange since the attack, filled with silver eyes and protective shadows that seemed almost real. Henrik brought daily reports on his recovery, which had accelerated dramatically after she'd gathered the bloodroot. The herb's potency seemed enhanced somehow, working faster and more effectively than she'd ever seen. "Whatever you did to prepare this medicine," he told her, "it's stronger than anything you've made before." She didn't mention that the bloodroot had been scattered in her own blood during the attack, mixing in ways no proper preparation would allow. The thought troubled her. Had her suffering somehow enhanced the herb's power? And if so, what did that suggest about forces stirring in the forest? On the 4th night after the attack, she was awakened by a sound like wind chimes, though no chimes hung anywhere near her cottage. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, almost like a lullaby, and it seemed to emanate from the forest itself. She hobbled to her window, supporting her splintered arm, and peered into the darkness between the trees. For just a moment, she thought she saw a tall figure standing among the pines, unnaturally still, with points of silver light where eyes might be. But when she blinked and looked again, only shadows and moonlight remained. The next, morning brought news that made the entire village uneasy. Gareth Morrison's prize-breeding ram had been found dead in its pen, killed by something that left no clear tracks or obvious wounds. The animal simply lay in the snow, unmarked but definitely deceased. Brom Fletcher reported that something had been tampering with his traps, removing the bait without triggering the mechanisms, and leaving behind an odd, sweet scent he couldn't identify. His hunting yields had dropped to nothing, as if the forest creatures had received warning to avoid his snares. Kyle Darren developed a persistent cough that no amount of rest or warmth seemed to relieve. His mother asked Maeryn for medicine, but when the young man arrived to receive treatment, he took one look at her splintered arm and bandaged face before fleeing without explanation. These incidents might have been dismissed as coincidence, if not for their timing and the growing sense that something watched the village with intelligent purpose. Parents began calling their children inside earlier each evening, and even the bravest hunters avoided venturing into the forest alone. Thomas continued studying his chronicle, cross-referencing the old stories with current events. The pattern that emerged both fascinated and terrified him. Every supernatural occurrence seemed connected to protecting Maeryn and making her attackers uncomfortable. According to legend, a life ward's justice began slowly, with signs and warnings designed to give the guilty opportunity for confession and repentance. Only if they continued to deny their crime would the Guardian escalate to direct action. He considered sharing his research with Maeryn, but decided to wait until her injuries healed further. If ancient powers truly had awakened to protect her, she would need all her strength for what might come next. In the deepest cavern beneath the ancient forest, Varrik stirred from the longest sleep he had known. 3 centuries of slumber fell away like dust as consciousness returned to limbs that had been still since the last healer died in these woods. The stone chamber that had been his refuge showed the weight of years. Stalactites had grown longer, and mineral deposits painted strange patterns on walls carved by hands that predated human memory. He sat up slowly, testing joints that protested after so long motionless. His body retained the supernatural strength and speed that came with his vampiric nature. But the extended dormancy had left him weakened. It would take time to regain his full abilities, time during which the innocent woman who had awakened him remained vulnerable. The scent that had called him from sleep still lingered in his heightened senses, blood spilled in violence, mixed with the essence of healing herbs and something deeper. Fear, pain, and betrayal had soaked into the earth above his chamber, creating a call that resonated through every oath he had ever sworn. Memories flooded back as he stood and began exploring his surroundings. The last healer had been a woman named Ilara, grandmother to the bloodline that now included the injured Maeryn. Ilara had found him dying of wounds received in humanity's war against his kind, and instead of finishing what soldiers had started, she had shown mercy. Her compassion had transformed him from monster to guardian. The binding ritual she'd performed had tied his existence to protecting those who healed and helped others, trading his freedom for purpose. For 2 centuries he had watched over her and her descendants, until Ilara's death had sent him into the deep sleep that preserved his essence until the next generation needed protection. Now that need had awakened him again, and the fury that filled his ancient heart burned with righteous purpose. Someone had dared harm one under his protection. Someone had shed innocent blood on ground he was sworn to guard. The hunt began that very night. He emerged from his cavern like mist given form, moving through the forest with the silence that had made his kind legendary predators. His senses, sharpened by centuries of existence, easily picked up the trails left by Maeryn's attackers. Their scents were marked by violence and guilt, making them as easy to follow as if they carried torches. Gareth Morrison's farmhouse stood at the village's western edge, a modest building that had seen better days. Varrik circled the structure like a wolf studying prey, noting every entrance and weakness. The man inside reeked of sour ale and nervous sweat, his sleep troubled by dreams that Varrik's presence only intensified. He could have killed the farmer with a thought. Vampiric power made physical barriers meaningless, and mortal strength laughably inadequate. But justice required more than simple execution. These men needed to understand the weight of their crime before paying its price. Varrik began with subtle harassment. He moved objects slightly out of place, created sounds that had no apparent source, and cast shadows that lingered where no shadows should exist. Gareth's prize ram died not from violence, but from terror. The animal's heart simply stopped. When confronted with a predator, its instincts couldn't comprehend. From Gareth's farm, he moved to Brom Fletcher's cottage, where the hunter lay drunk and insensible. Brom's traps received special attention. Varrik removed every bait and left behind traces of his presence that would confuse and unnerve the man. The sweet scent Brom had noticed was the lingering essence of flowers that had bloomed in Alara's garden centuries ago, now carried wherever Varrik walked. Young Kyle Darren proved the most interesting target. Unlike his older companions, the boy showed genuine remorse for what they'd done. Guilt ate at him like a physical ailment, manifesting as the persistent cough that no medicine could cure. Varrik sensed the potential for redemption in this one and adjusted his approach accordingly. Instead of pure intimidation, he began leaving signs that encouraged confession. A white flower on Kyle's windowsill, the same type Maeryn grew for her healing work. A mirror positioned to reflect the forest path where their crime had occurred. Small reminders designed to strengthen the young man's conscience rather than break his spirit. The work satisfied Varrik in ways he had nearly forgotten. For 3 centuries he had existed without purpose, sustained only by the binding oath that kept him tied to this realm. Now he felt the righteous anger of a protector again, tempered by the wisdom that came from understanding both justice and mercy. Yet hunting the guilty was only half his responsibility. The binding oath also required him to guard the innocent who had awakened him. Maeryn's vulnerability called to every protective instinct he possessed, complicated by emotions he hadn't expected. When he observed her through her cottage windows, he saw not just the descendant of his original protector, but a woman whose kindness and strength reminded him of what he had once been. Before the transformation that made him vampire, he had been a healer himself, a physician who tried to save lives rather than take them. Maeryn's dedication to her calling echoed his own lost humanity. Watching her tend other villagers despite her own injuries, he felt an unfamiliar warmth stirring in what remained of his heart. The binding oath protected her life, but something deeper made him want to shield her from every source of pain. His presence in the forest began attracting attention from creatures that recognized supernatural authority. Wolves padded through the snow to acknowledge him, lowering their heads in instinctive submission before returning to their territories. Ravens gathered in unusual numbers, serving as his eyes and ears throughout the surrounding area. The village dogs sensed him too, though they responded with nervous energy rather than recognition. Their constant whining warned of something beyond their understanding, lurking just outside human perception. Children proved most sensitive to his influence. They complained of strange dreams featuring silver eyes and protective shadows. Some reported seeing a tall figure watching from the tree line, though parents dismissed such accounts as winter-induced imagination. Maeryn herself began experiencing unusual sensations. Her healing abilities seemed enhanced, working more effectively than ever before. Plants she touched grew stronger, and her remedies showed increased potency. She attributed these improvements to better rest during her recovery, unaware that supernatural influence strengthened everything connected to her calling. Her dreams grew more vivid each night, filled with images that seemed like memories from someone else's life. She saw a great stone chamber lit by silver light, a woman with her own features, performing rituals with ancient power, and always those silver eyes watching with infinite patience and care. During her waking hours, she felt increasingly protected despite the isolation of her cottage. The forest that had once seemed merely familiar now felt actively welcoming, as if the trees themselves stood guard around her home. As Varrik's first week of renewed consciousness ended, he had successfully established his presence without revealing his true nature. The guilty men grew more agitated daily, while Maeryn healed under his distant but constant protection. Soon, he would need to decide whether psychological pressure alone would bring confession and repentance, or if stronger measures were required to satisfy the demands of justice. 2 weeks after the attack, Maeryn felt strong enough to venture beyond her cottage for more than brief walks to the village centre. Her arm remained splintered, but caused less constant pain, and her ribs had healed enough to allow deeper breathing. The bruises on her face had faded from purple to yellow, making her appearance less alarming to the children she treated. Elder Thomas had grown increasingly insistent about sharing his research into the village's supernatural history. He arrived at her cottage that evening, carrying his ancient chronicle book and wearing an expression that mixed excitement with deep concern. "There are things you need to know," he said without preamble, settling into the chair beside her fireplace. "Things that might explain what's been happening since your attack." She set aside the herb preparation she'd been working on and gave him her full attention. Thomas rarely spoke with such gravity, unless the matter was truly serious. He opened the chronicle to a page marked with a ribbon and began reading passages about the Life Ward, the supernatural guardian that ancient oaths had bound to protect healers and innocent blood. The descriptions matched too closely with recent events to dismiss as coincidence. "You think something like this has awakened?" she asked, though part of her already believed it. Her dreams had grown too vivid and consistent to be merely trauma-induced imagination. "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that your blood spilled on consecrated ground called something from deep sleep. Something that's been waiting since my great-great-grandmother's time for the next generation to need protection." They discussed the implications, while wind rattled her shutters and snow began falling again outside. If ancient powers truly watched over her, it explained the enhanced potency of her medicines and the growing unease among certain villagers. That night, after Thomas left with promises to research further, Maeryn made a decision that would have seemed foolish before her attack. She wrapped herself in warm clothing, took her mother's silver knife for gathering herbs, and walked into the forest under the full moon's light. She needed to understand what protected her, and instinct suggested that understanding would come only through direct contact. The forest felt different as she walked, more alive, more aware, as if every tree held consciousness that recognized her presence. Her steps led her deeper than usual, following paths she didn't remember choosing, but that felt familiar nonetheless. The silver light filtering through pine branches created a cathedral atmosphere that made even breathing seem like prayer. She found him waiting in a moonlit clearing where ancient standing stones formed a perfect circle. He stood motionless among the markers, so tall and still that she might have mistaken him for another stone pillar, if not for the silver eyes that reflected moonlight like polished metal. Terror should have sent her fleeing. Instead, she felt an odd sense of completion, as if a puzzle piece had finally fallen into place. This was the presence she'd sensed watching over her, the guardian whose protection had made her cottage feel safe, despite her attackers remaining free. "You shouldn't be here," he said, and his voice carried the weight of centuries, formal, precise, with an accent she couldn't place. "It isn't safe for you to seek me directly." "Nowhere has been safe since they hurt me," she replied, surprised by her own calm. "But I've felt protected despite that." "Was it you?" He stepped closer, moonlight revealing features that might have been carved from marble. Beautiful in an inhuman way, with sharp angles and pale skin that seemed to emit its own faint luminescence. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, and he wore clothes that suggested either careful preservation or timeless fashion. "I am bound by oath to protect those who heal others," he said. "Your blood called to me from sleep that had lasted 3 centuries. "You're the life ward Thomas read about," she said, understanding flooding through her. The guardian mentioned in the old chronicles. "I am Varrik, last of the alpha vampires, bound to your bloodline by ties that transcend death itself." The admission came with obvious reluctance, as if revealing his nature caused physical pain. She should have been terrified by the word vampire. Instead, she found herself studying his face for signs of the monster legends described. She saw ancient sadness, carefully controlled power, and something that might have been loneliness so profound it had become part of his essential nature. "Why don't I fear you?" she asked. "Because your ancestor, Ilara, taught me to value mercy over hunger. Because the oath that binds me transformed predator into protector. Because you recognize in me what she saw, a being capable of redemption through service to others." He told her then about the original binding, speaking in low tones that somehow carried clearly despite the wind. Ilara had found him dying from wounds received in humanity's war against vampires, and instead of letting him perish or finishing what soldiers had started, she had offered a different choice. "Serve life instead of death," he quoted her words. "Protect instead of prey. Use your unnatural strength to guard those who cannot guard themselves." The ritual had transformed his very essence, trading his freedom for purpose and tying his existence to the welfare of her bloodline. For 2 centuries, he had watched over Ilara and her descendants, until her death sent him into deep slumber that preserved his essence until the next generation needed protection. "My protection comes at a cost," he warned her. "Those bound to me live under supernatural scrutiny that ordinary people cannot understand. Your life will never be entirely your own again." "My life was already given to others," she replied. "I chose to serve as a healer. This seems merely an extension of that choice." They talked until dawn threatened, and she learned that her enhanced abilities came from their supernatural connection. Her medicines worked more effectively because his power flowed through them. Her dreams were memories shared across the binding that connected their souls. In turn, she told him about her life, about Eldric's death, her dedication to healing, and the growing isolation that came with being essential to everyone's welfare, but close to no one's heart. Loneliness, he said with deep understanding, becomes a familiar companion when your nature sets you apart from ordinary human experience. When eastern sky began showing hints of light, he prepared to leave. I must return to shelter before full dawn. Vampire nature remains part of what I am, even transformed by oath and purpose. Will I see you again? Every night, if you wish it. But know that seeking my company binds us closer together. Each meeting strengthens ties that death itself cannot break. She watched him fade into shadow and mist, disappearing so completely she might have thought him imagination, if not for the amber pendant her mother had left her. The stone now glowed with faint inner light, evidence of supernatural influence that couldn't be dismissed as fancy. Walking home through the pre-dawn forest, she felt more peaceful than she had since the attack. Understanding her protector had replaced fear with something approaching wonder. She was no longer simply Maeryn the healer. She had become part of something larger and more ancient than the village that had been her entire world. The three men who had attacked Maeryn were slowly unraveling under supernatural pressure. Gareth Morrison had lost 2 more animals to mysterious circumstances. A milk cow found dead without injury, and his best laying hen discovered with its neck twisted in patterns that suggested no ordinary predator. His wife, Nora, begged him to seek Maeryn's help for whatever curse had befallen their homestead, not knowing her husband was the cause of his own torment. Brom Fletcher fared worse. His traps remained empty night after night, as if every creature in the forest had received warning to avoid his snares. He'd taken to drinking himself unconscious. Each evening, hoping alcohol might quiet the whispers that seemed to follow him everywhere. His hunting skills, once the pride of the village, had abandoned him completely. Young Cale Darren surprised everyone by seeking out Elder Tomas for private counsel. The cough that plagued him had worsened, and he'd begun coughing up flower petals, white blossoms like those Maeryn cultivated for healing. No physician could explain the phenomenon, and Cale grew more desperate for absolution with each passing day. Gareth, the most stubborn of the three, refused to accept that supernatural forces pursued them. Instead, he convinced himself that coincidence and bad luck had combined to torment him. His pride would not allow confession, and his desperation drove him to seek earthly solutions to other worldly problems. That desperation led him to contact Captain Dreven, a mercenary who operated throughout the northern territories with a band of sellswards willing to undertake any task for sufficient coin. Gareth had encountered Dreven the previous spring when the mercenary had passed through Ravenhollow, seeking supplies and information about regional politics. The message Gareth sent was carefully worded to avoid direct admission of guilt while suggesting that supernatural forces threatened the village's stability. He claimed a demon had taken residence in the local forest and was systematically destroying the livelihoods of honest farmers and hunters. Dreven's response arrived within a week, carried by a scarred messenger who looked capable of violence without remorse. The mercenary captain was intrigued by reports of supernatural activity and would arrive within the month with men and equipment suitable for dealing with otherworldly threats. The letter also requested detailed information about the demons, patterns, and weaknesses, along with advance payment in silver, the traditional metal for fighting supernatural entities. Gareth began liquidating his few remaining assets to meet the financial demands, convincing himself that hired protection would solve his problems more effectively than confession ever could. Meanwhile, Maeryn's nightly meetings with Varrik had become the most meaningful part of her daily routine. They would gather in the stone circle where ancient rituals had once bound protector to protected, sharing stories and slowly building trust that transcended the supernatural circumstances of their connection. Varrik told her about his mortal life as a physician, in an age when medicine relied more on herb lore than surgical precision. His transformation into vampire had been involuntary, the result of an attack by creatures that viewed humans as livestock rather than equals. The bitter irony that someone dedicated to preserving life had become an apex predator was not lost on either of them. Elara saw potential for redemption where others saw only monster, he explained during one of their conversations. She believed that what we become matters less than what we choose to do with what we've become. Maeryn found herself sharing details of her own life that she'd never discussed with living people. The loneliness of being the village's only healer, always essential, but never simply human in others' eyes. The weight of responsibility that came with holding people's lives in her hands. The dreams she'd abandoned when Aldrich died, and healing became her sole identity. "You understand," she said one night, "what it means to be necessary, but never quite belonging anywhere. Isolation becomes familiar when your nature sets you apart," he agreed. "Though I confess, these conversations with you remind me what companionship feels like." Their growing closeness did not escape his notice, nor the dangerous implications it carried. The binding oath protected her life, but said nothing about protecting his heart from attachments that could compromise his judgment. Yet he found himself looking forward to their meetings with anticipation that felt suspiciously like joy. She began bringing small gifts to their encounters, herbal teas that warmed him despite his supernatural nature, books of poetry copied in her careful hand, and once a small carved figure of a wolf that reminded her of his protective presence. He reciprocated with flowers that bloomed out of season through his influence, and rare herbs gathered from places only he could safely reach. The romantic tension between them, built gradually, expressed more through meaningful glances and careful words than physical contact. Both understood that love between mortal and vampire carried complications that ordinary courtship never faced. One evening, as they sat beside the ancient stones discussing the ethical complexities of supernatural justice, she reached out to touch his hand. The contact sent warmth through both of them that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with connection that transcended physical existence. "This is dangerous," he whispered, though he made no move to pull away. "Everything worthwhile carries some danger," she replied. "The question is whether the risk is justified by what we might gain." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm that felt like a promise. "I have spent 3 centuries existing without truly living. You make me remember what it means to hope for more than mere survival." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching through the forest, unusual for the late hour and heavy snow. Varrik's enhanced senses immediately detected multiple riders armed with metal weapons and carrying unfamiliar scents. "You must return to your cottage immediately," he said, urgency replacing tenderness. "Armed strangers approach the village, and their intentions feel hostile." She wanted to argue, but recognized the authority in his voice that came from centuries of protecting those under his care. "Will you be safe?" "It will take more than mortal weapons to threaten me," he assured her. "But you remain vulnerable to ordinary violence, and these men carry the scent of those who kill for coin." He escorted her through the forest with supernatural speed, moving so quickly that the journey passed like a dream. At her cottage door, he paused to study the approaching threat with senses that could detect details invisible to human perception. "Lock your doors and stay inside until dawn," he instructed. "Trust in the protection I can provide, but do not test it unnecessarily." As he melted back into shadow, Maeryn secured her cottage and tried to sleep, despite growing anxiety. Outside, the sound of horses entering the village carried clearly through the winter air, along with harsh voices speaking in dialects she didn't recognize. Captain Draven had arrived with his mercenaries, bringing blessed weapons and supernatural expertise to hunt the guardian that protected her. The conflict that had begun with personal desperation was about to escalate into something approaching war between mortal ambition and other-worldly justice. Captain Draven proved to be everything Gareth had hoped, and more than he'd bargained for. The mercenary leader stood nearly as tall as Varrik, but carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to human conflicts where supernatural powers played no role. His weathered face bore scars that spoke of countless battles, and his pale blue eyes held the calculating coldness of a man who viewed violence as simply another tool for solving problems. The dozen men who accompanied him looked equally dangerous. Sellswords who'd learned their trade in border wars where mercy was a luxury few could afford. They carried an arsenal of weapons that included iron blades, silver-tipped crossbow bolts, and small vials of what appeared to be blessed water or oil. "Show me where this demon has been active," Draven commanded Gareth, after settling his men in the village's abandoned grain warehouse. "I need to understand its patterns before we begin the hunt." Gareth led him through the village, pointing out locations where supernatural incidents had occurred. His prize ram's pen, Brom's empty hunting grounds, and the forest paths where strange tracks had appeared in the snow. He carefully avoided mentioning his own role in creating the circumstances that had awakened Varrik. Draven listened with the professional attention of someone who'd hunted supernatural entities before. "The pattern suggests a territorial guardian, rather than a random predator," he concluded. "Something bound to protect specific locations or people. Have there been any recent attacks on villages that might have triggered a protective response?" The question struck too close to truth for Gareth's comfort. "Nothing significant," he lied. "Perhaps some minor disputes, but nothing that would justify demonic intervention." Meanwhile, Maeryn spent an anxious day tending to her usual patients while trying to gather information about the armed strangers. The villagers were nervous about having mercenaries in their midst, especially men who openly discussed hunting supernatural creatures. Elder Tomasz visited her cottage that evening, his face grave with worry. "These men carry blessed weapons and speak of binding rituals," he reported. "They're not mere sellswords, they're supernatural hunters with experience fighting other-worldly entities." "Do they know about Varrik specifically?" she asked. "Not yet, but they're asking the right questions. It's only a matter of time before someone mentions the strange incidents, and from there they'll piece together that something protects you." That night, she waited in the stone circle for Varrik's arrival with growing desperation. When he finally appeared, she saw immediately that he carried knowledge that would change everything between them. "There are things about our binding that I haven't told you," he said without preamble. "Things you need to know before these hunters force a confrontation that neither of us may survive." He led her deeper into the forest than ever before, to a hidden grove where moonlight revealed an ancient altar carved from a single massive stone. The surface bore intricate symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, and dried flowers from centuries past lay scattered around its base. "This is where Ilara bound me to your bloodline," he explained, "and this is where the true cost of that binding was paid." The story he told shattered every assumption she'd made about their supernatural connection. The binding oath wasn't simply a promise to protect. It was a magical contract that required periodic renewal through the willing sacrifice of the healer it protected. "Every generation, the protected descendant must choose," Varrik said, his voice heavy with centuries of guilt. "Accept death to renew the binding and ensure protection for the next generation, or allow the oath to lapse and leave future healers defenseless. Elara had made that choice willingly, as had her daughter and granddaughter before her. Each had lived long enough to train their successor and see the bloodline continued, then had given their lives to maintain the supernatural protection that kept their descendants safe. "You're telling me that I'm destined to die for this magic to continue?" Maeryn asked, though part of her had already suspected some such truth. "Not destined," he corrected. "The choice remains yours, as it was theirs. But if you refuse the sacrifice, the binding will fail, and I will fade back into whatever realm holds creatures like me. Your children, should you have them, will face the world's dangers without supernatural protection." The revelation struck her like a physical blow. Everything she'd begun to hope for, love with Varrik, a life beyond simple service to others, perhaps even a family of her own, suddenly seemed like cruel illusions. "How long do I have?" she whispered. "The binding weakens slowly. Perhaps a year, perhaps 2. You'll feel it when the time approaches. A pull toward this altar, and an understanding that renewal can't be delayed much longer." She sank to her knees beside the sacrificial stone, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd revealed. "And if I choose to break the binding instead? Then I become free to leave this realm, but your bloodline loses its protection forever. Future generations will face whatever dangers threaten them with only mortal strength and wisdom." They sat in silence while she processed the implications. Every woman in her line had faced this same impossible choice: die to protect descendants they might never meet, or live and leave those descendants vulnerable to whatever threatened healers and innocents. "Is there no other way?" she finally asked. "None that I know of. The binding requires a willing sacrifice from the protected bloodline. It's the price of supernatural protection. Someone must pay with their life for magic that transcends mortal limitations." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Varrik rose immediately, his supernatural senses detecting the intruders long before Maeryn could hear them. "Armed men," he whispered urgently. "At least 6, moving with military precision and carrying blessed weapons. They've found our meeting place." She stood as well, her mind still reeling from his revelations. "What do we do?" "You return to the village immediately. I'll delay them long enough for you to reach safety." "And then what?" "They won't stop hunting you, and I can't hide forever." He cupped her face in his hands, silver eyes reflecting moonlight and something that might have been desperate love. "Then perhaps it's time for both of us to make choices about what we're willing to sacrifice for what we believe in." The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft clink of metal weapons and muttered communications between the hunters. Captain Draven had apparently decided to begin his supernatural hunt without waiting for dawn. "Whatever happens," Varrik said softly, "remember that love doesn't require sacrifice to prove its worth. Your life has value beyond its service to others, and your choices should honor that value." He kissed her then, gently but with the desperation of someone who understood that circumstances beyond their control were about to tear them apart. When they separated, she could see the internal struggle between his duty to protect her and his desire to fight for their future together. "Go," he whispered. "Please. Let me do what I was bound to do, keep you safe from those who would harm you." She wanted to argue, to insist on facing the threat together, but recognized the authority in his voice that came from centuries of experience. Instead, she pressed a quick kiss to his palm and ran toward the village, leaving him to face whatever pursuit Draven's mercenaries brought. Behind her, she heard the first shouts of confrontation as supernatural guardian met mortal hunters in a conflict that would determine whether ancient protections could withstand modern weapons and tactics. The revelation that her life was forfeit to maintain the binding oath changed everything she'd begun to hope for. But as she ran through moonlit forest toward whatever safety her cottage might provide, she found herself thinking not about the death that awaited her, but about the possibility that love might offer alternatives that ancient magic had never considered. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would affect not just her own fate, but the future of every healer who might someday need the protection that her bloodline had purchased with willing sacrifice. Tonight, she could only pray that Varrik would survive the hunters long enough for them to find solutions that honored both love and duty. Maeryn reached her cottage as the sounds of battle erupted from the forest depths. Inhuman roars mixed with shouted commands and the clash of steel against something that rang like struck stone. Whatever confrontation had begun between Varrik and the hunters would determine the fate of everyone in Ravenhollow. She burst through her door to find Elder Tomas waiting by her fireplace, his ancient chronicle spread across her work table, alongside materials she didn't immediately recognize: candles, crystals, and what appeared to be carefully measured portions of herbs and minerals. "I heard the commotion," he said, without looking up from his preparations. "The hunters have found your protector, haven't they?" "How did you—" "Because I've been researching alternatives to the binding ritual since the night you were attacked," he interrupted. "There has to be another way to maintain supernatural protection without requiring generational sacrifice. No system of magic that demands such prices can be the only solution available." She collapsed into her chair, exhaustion and emotional turmoil finally overwhelming her. "Varrik told me about the binding's true cost. Every woman in my bloodline has died to renew the protection for the next generation." Tomas finally looked up, his weathered face showing deep sympathy. "And you've decided to break the binding rather than perpetuate that cycle." The statement wasn't a question. Somehow, the elderly man had reached the same conclusion she was still struggling to accept. "I can't condemn my daughters, if I ever have any, to the same fate. And I can't ask Varrik to watch another generation of women sacrifice themselves for his continued servitude." "Then we need to act quickly," Tomas said, returning to his preparations. "The binding can be altered, but it requires the consent of both parties, and a ritual performed during the time of greatest supernatural activity. Tonight, while your protector fights for his existence, provides that opportunity." He explained what his research had uncovered. The original binding had been hastily constructed during a crisis, designed to save Varrik's life and provide protection, but not carefully considered for its long-term consequences. Like many magical contracts, it could be renegotiated if both parties agreed to new terms. "Instead of one protector, bound to one bloodline through sacrifice," he said, "we can create a covenant between protector and entire community. Varrik's power would be maintained through collective will rather than individual death, and the protection would extend to anyone in need, rather than just your descendants." The ritual required components that represented community bonds: earth from every household, water from the communal well, fire kindled from the village's central hearth, and air blessed by collective intention. Tomas had spent the day gathering these materials while she'd been treating patients. "Will he survive long enough for us to attempt this?" she asked, listening to the ongoing sounds of battle. "Supernatural entities are remarkably difficult to kill permanently," Tomas assured her, "especially one as old and powerful as your guardian. But mortal weapons blessed with the right intentions can cause significant damage, and those hunters came prepared for extended combat. As if summoned by their conversation, a tremendous crash shook the forest, followed by a roar that sounded more animal than human. Windows throughout the village rattled in their frames, and several people called out in fear. "We need to gather the villagers," Maeryn decided. "If this ritual requires community participation, then the community needs to understand what they're agreeing to protect." Despite the late hour and obvious danger, word spread quickly through Ravenhollow. Within an hour, most of the village had gathered in the central square, drawn by curiosity, concern, and the increasingly violent sounds emanating from the forest. Maeryn stood before her neighbors, people she'd delivered as babies, treated through illnesses, and comforted through losses, and told them the truth about what protected their village. She spoke of ancient oaths and supernatural guardians, of bindings that required sacrifice and alternatives that demanded courage. "There's something in our forest that has watched over healers and innocents for centuries," she said. "Tonight, men with weapons are trying to destroy that protection because they don't understand its purpose." She expected skepticism, even mockery. Instead, she found widespread acceptance that surprised her. These people had lived through too many strange occurrences since her attack to dismiss supernatural explanations easily. Henrik stepped forward first. "You saved my life with medicine that worked better than anything I've ever seen. If something helped you do that, then I'll stand with it." Isla, heavily pregnant and supported by her husband, nodded agreement. "The baby's been calm since your protector arrived. Whatever it is, it means no harm to those who mean no harm." One by one, families voiced their willingness to participate in protecting something that had protected them. Even those who'd been skeptical of supernatural claims found themselves convinced by the evidence of their own experiences. Young Kyle Darren surprised everyone by pushing through the crowd to kneel before Maeryn. "I was one of the men who attacked you," he confessed, his voice breaking. "We hurt you because we were angry and desperate, and I've been dying inside ever since." The crowd murmured in shock, but Kyle continued his confession without raising his head. "The guardian that's fighting in the forest, it's been tormenting us since that night. Not to kill us, but to make us understand what we'd done. I want to help protect it now, if that can make up for what we did to you." Maeryn knelt beside the young man and lifted his chin until their eyes met. "Confession and repentance are the beginning of redemption," she said gently. "You're welcome to stand with us." Brom Fletcher emerged from the crowd's edge, looking haggard and ashamed. "I was there too," he admitted, "and I'll face whatever justice comes. But I want to help stop this fight. Gareth brought those hunters here. He's the one who started this war." As if summoned by his name, Gareth Morrison appeared at the square's opposite edge, flanked by Captain Dreven and several mercenaries who looked worn from their supernatural encounter. Blood stained their weapons, though whether it belonged to them or their quarry wasn't immediately clear. "There's your demon worshippers," Gareth shouted, pointing at the gathered villagers. "The whole village has been corrupted by whatever evil lives in those woods." Draven studied the crowd with calculating eyes. "Which one of you is the healer?" he asked. "The creature we're hunting shows particular aggression when we mention harming someone by that description." "I am," Maeryn said, stepping forward despite Tomas's restraining hand on her arm. "And if you've hurt the guardian that protects this village, then you've made an enemy of everyone here." "Protects?" Draven laughed harshly. "Madam, what you call protection, I call supernatural predation. Creatures like the one in your forest feed on human faith and fear, growing stronger by convincing communities they need otherworldly salvation." "You're wrong," she replied firmly. The guardian you're fighting has never harmed anyone who didn't first shed innocent blood. It protects healers and those who help others because that protection strengthens community bonds rather than destroying them. The mercenary captain drew his sword, a blade that gleamed with more than reflected moonlight. Silver inlay and blessed inscriptions covered its surface, marking it as a weapon specifically crafted for supernatural warfare. "Then you won't mind if we remove this protector permanently," he said. "If it's truly benevolent, its death should cause no harm to your community. Its death would remove protection that has kept this village safe for generations," Tomas interjected, moving to stand beside Maeryn. "And we won't permit that to happen." The confrontation might have escalated to immediate violence if not for Varrik's arrival. He materialized from shadow at the square's center, his clothes torn and stained with blood that might or might not have been his own. Silver eyes blazed with supernatural fury, and his presence radiated power that made several mercenaries step backward involuntarily. "Enough," he said, and his voice carried authority that transcended mere volume. "This ends now." He looked directly at Maeryn, and she saw in his expression both desperate love and resigned acceptance. "I felt the binding weakening during our fight," he told her. "You've made your choice about breaking our contract." "I've made a different choice," she corrected, "about transforming our contract into something better." She turned to address the entire crowd, villagers and mercenaries alike. "We're going to perform a ritual that changes how supernatural protection works in this place. Instead of one guardian bound to one bloodline through sacrifice, we're creating a covenant between protector and community that serves everyone's needs." "And if we refuse to permit this ritual?" Draven demanded. Varrik smiled, showing teeth that seemed sharper than they had moments before. "Then you'll discover why alpha vampires were feared throughout this realm, before oaths transformed predators into protectors." The threat hung in the winter air like frost, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Everyone present understood that the next few minutes would determine whether Ravenhollow found a new way forward or descended into supernatural warfare that would leave no one unscathed. Maeryn began unpacking Tomas's ritual materials while keeping her eyes on both Draven and Varrik. One represented the danger of rejecting change, the other the hope of finding solutions that honored both tradition and innovation. "The choice belongs to all of you," she said to the gathered villagers. "Stand with us and help create protection that serves the entire community, or step aside and let others decide your fate." As she spoke, more villagers moved to stand with her, forming a protective circle around the ritual space. Even some of Draven's mercenaries seemed uncertain about fighting an entire community to eliminate a guardian that showed no hostility toward innocents. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of one supernatural protector, but the future of community cooperation in the face of external threats. The ritual began as dawn approached, with Maeryn and Elder Tomas working quickly to arrange the community covenant, while Varrik stood guard against Draven's mercenaries. The ancient binding stone in the forest had begun to crack audibly, its supernatural energy destabilizing as the original oath weakened. Maeryn placed the gathered materials, earth from every household, blessed water, communal fire, and consecrated air, in a careful pattern around the village square's center. Each element represented the community's willingness to share responsibility for protecting those who served others. "This is madness," Captain Draven declared, though he made no immediate move to interfere. "You're attempting to bind an entire village to a supernatural predator. When it turns on you, as such creatures inevitably do, you'll have no recourse. We're not binding ourselves to a predator, Maeryn replied, continuing her preparations. We're offering partnership to a protector who has served faithfully for 3 centuries. Varrik's oath ring had appeared on his finger, a silver band that manifested only when he acted in his role as guardian. Now it burned with increasing intensity as the ritual progressed, responding to the transformation of his fundamental nature. The first attack came without warning. 3 mercenaries rushed Varrik simultaneously, wielding blessed blades designed to disrupt supernatural essence. He moved with inhuman speed, but his injuries from the forest battle had weakened him enough that mortal weapons posed genuine threat. Silver blades scored across his arm and shoulder, drawing blood that steamed in the cold air. The wounds burned with holy fire that prevented immediate healing, forcing him to fight through pain that would have incapacitated ordinary beings. "Continue the ritual," he called to Maeryn, while parrying a thrust aimed at his heart. "Don't stop for anything." She began reciting the words Tomas had helped her prepare, ancient phrases that spoke of community bonds and shared responsibility. As each villager added their voice to the chant, power began building in the ritual space. Draven realized that interrupting the ceremony required more direct action. He charged toward Maeryn with his blessed sword raised, clearly intending to kill the ritual's focus before the transformation could complete. Brom Fletcher intercepted him, wielding a woodsman's axe with desperate courage. "You won't hurt her again," he shouted, striking at the mercenary captain with surprising skill. The 2 men clashed in brutal combat while the ritual continued around them. Draven's superior training showed immediately, but Brom's guilt-fueled determination kept him fighting despite accumulating wounds. Kyle joined the defense, throwing himself at one of the mercenaries threatening the ritual circle. His youth and inexperience showed, but his desperate need for redemption gave him strength to continue despite being badly outmatched. Henrik and several other villagers formed a protective line around Maeryn and Tomas, wielding farming tools and hunting weapons against professional soldiers. They lacked military training, but fought with the fierce determination of people defending their homes and families. The binding stone in the forest shattered completely as the original oath finally dissolved. Energy released by the breaking contract surged through the village like lightning, causing every supernatural weapon to flare with brilliant light. Varrik staggered as his vampire nature reasserted itself temporarily. Without the binding oath to channel his predatory instincts into protective service, he became momentarily vulnerable to the savage hunger that defined his species. Maeryn felt the change immediately through their emotional connection. "Hold on to who you choose to be," she called to him while maintaining the ritual chant. "Don't let old instincts define your future." Her words seemed to anchor him as the community's collective will began replacing the individual binding. Instead of one person's sacrifice sustaining his protective nature, dozens of voices offered willing partnership in maintaining supernatural guardianship. The transformation manifested physically as silver light began emanating from every villager participating in the ritual. Their combined intention created a new form of magical contract, one based on mutual cooperation rather than sacrificial obligation. Draven's sword blazed with holy fire as he struck down Brom Fletcher, the blessed blade cutting through both body and spirit. "One fewer demon worshipper," he snarled, turning back toward Maeryn. The healer's grief at Brom's death nearly broke her concentration, but Elder Thomas steadied her with a firm hand on her shoulder. "His sacrifice strengthens the covenant," he whispered. "Don't let it be wasted." Varrik's nature solidified into something unprecedented, a vampire whose predatory essence had been permanently transformed by community acceptance rather than individual binding. He no longer needed to struggle against hunger and bloodlust. Those drives had been replaced by genuine desire to protect and serve. The change manifested as dawn broke fully, revealing that his pale skin now held a subtle luminescence that suggested life rather than undeath. His silver eyes blazed with purpose that transcended supernatural compulsion, becoming conscious choice supported by collective will. "The covenant is sealed," Maeryn announced, as the ritual reached completion. Ravenhollow now stands under protection, freely given and freely accepted. But Draven and his remaining mercenaries showed no intention of acknowledging the village's new supernatural alliance. If anything, Varrik's transformation seemed to enrage them further. The completion of the covenant ritual had transformed more than just Varrik's nature. It had awakened protective instincts throughout the entire village. Men and women who had never held weapons in anger now fought with desperate courage to defend their supernatural guardian and the healer who had served them faithfully for decades. Draven's remaining mercenaries found themselves facing not a handful of defenders, but an entire community united by shared purpose. Henrik, despite his recent illness, wielded a blacksmith's hammer with surprising effectiveness. Young mothers like Isla stayed back from direct combat, but provided tactical support, calling out warnings and tending wounded defenders. Even the children contributed, running messages between fighters and helping to evacuate the most vulnerable villagers to safer locations. The community had become a single organism, dedicated to protecting what they had chosen to embrace. Varrik's enhanced abilities manifested immediately. Where the individual binding had limited his power to specific protective actions, the community covenant amplified his capabilities through collective belief and support. He moved through the battle like a living shadow, appearing wherever defenders needed help most. When two mercenaries cornered Henrik near the blacksmith shop, Varrik materialized between them with inhuman speed. His strikes were precise rather than brutal, disabling rather than killing, showing mercy even toward those who had come to destroy him. "You could have lived peacefully," he told them as they fell unconscious. "Your captain's hatred need not have been yours." Captain Draven proved more challenging. The mercenary leader had decades of experience fighting supernatural entities, and his blessed weapons caused genuine damage to Varrik's transformed essence. Their duel moved through the village square with lethal grace, neither combatant giving ground easily. "You think community acceptance changes what you are?" Draven snarled between sword strikes. "You're still a vampire, still a predator that feeds on human life force. This ritual has simply made your feeding more subtle." "I am what I choose to be," Varrik replied, deflecting a thrust aimed at his heart. "As are you. The difference is that I chose protection over predation, while you chose hatred over understanding." Their battle might have continued indefinitely if not for Maeryn's intervention. She approached the combatants carrying her mother's silver ritual knife, its blade now glowing with the same light that suffused every villager participating in the covenant. "Enough killing," she said with quiet authority. "This ends now, one way or another." Draven spun toward her, recognizing that eliminating the ritual's focus might still disrupt the supernatural transformation. "Perfect. Remove the source, and the magic fails." He lunged at her with his blessed blade, but Varrik intercepted the attack with movements too fast for human eyes to follow. The impact of supernatural strength meeting enchanted steel created a shockwave that shattered every window in the village square. What happened next surprised everyone, including Varrik himself. Instead of simply blocking Draven's attack, his defensive action triggered a surge of community power that flowed through the covenant bond. every villager contributing to the Ihap War. Protective magic channeled their intention through him, creating force that transcended individual supernatural ability. The blessed sword, designed to destroy otherworldly entities, shattered against power, backed by collective human will. Dreven stumbled backward, staring at the broken hilt in his hand with obvious shock. "Impossible," he whispered. "Mortal faith cannot overcome consecrated steel." "Mortal faith guided by supernatural wisdom and tempered by genuine love," Tomas corrected, approaching the defeated captain. "That combination has always been more powerful than weapons designed for destruction." The remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader disarmed and their supernatural quarry protected by an entire community, began laying down their weapons. Fighting a single vampire was within their capabilities. Fighting an entire village united in supernatural alliance was beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. Varrik stood amid the aftermath, his transformed nature now stable and permanent. The community covenant had succeeded, where individual binding had merely postponed the inevitable. Instead of requiring periodic sacrifice to maintain protective magic, the new arrangement drew strength from ongoing cooperation and mutual support. Maeryn approached him as the immediate danger passed, her healer's instincts automatically cataloguing his injuries. "Are you hurt badly?" "Nothing that won't heal quickly now," he assured her. "The community's acceptance speeds my recovery as well as my protective abilities." They turned to survey the village square, where neighbors helped neighbors tend wounds and clear debris from the supernatural battle. The scene showed humanity at its finest, people setting aside personal differences to protect what they valued collectively. Elder Tomas was already organizing efforts to care for the wounded mercenaries. Despite their hostile intentions, the village would provide healing and shelter before sending them away. "We protect life here," he explained to anyone who questioned the decision. "That includes former enemies who no longer pose threats." Gareth Morrison stood apart from the community celebration, realizing that his betrayal had isolated him from the very neighbors he'd tried to rob. His alliance with the mercenaries had backfired completely, leaving him without friends or supporters. Kyle Darren approached his former conspirator with obvious reluctance, but determined purpose. "It's not too late to ask for forgiveness," he said, quietly. "The village forgives those who genuinely repent their mistakes." As dawn fully illuminated Ravenhollow, the supernatural battle's aftermath revealed a community transformed by crisis into something stronger than it had been before. The covenant that protected them had also united them in ways that would extend far beyond supernatural concerns. 1 year after the night that changed everything, Maeryn walked through Ravenhollow's bustling market square on a crisp autumn morning. The village bore little resemblance to the struggling community that had nearly torn itself apart through desperation and fear. Where once empty stalls and worried faces had dominated the weekly gathering, now merchants from neighboring settlements came to trade with a village known throughout the region for its prosperity and safety. The transformation went deeper than mere economic improvement. Something fundamental had changed in how the villagers related to each other and to the world beyond their borders. The community covenant that protected them had also taught them to protect each other with a dedication that extended far beyond supernatural concerns. Maeryn paused at Henrik's expanded blacksmith shop, where the former invalid now worked alongside 2 apprentices, filling orders for tools and decorative ironwork that had gained reputation for exceptional quality. His recovery from the lung fever that should have killed him had become legendary, drawing people from distant villages who sought the healing skills of the protected healer. "Morning, Healer Maeryn," he called out, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The commission for the new settlement's tools is nearly finished. They're offering premium payment, just to have metalwork blessed by Ravenhollow craftsmanship. She smiled at his enthusiasm. Henrik's transformation from bitter invalid to thriving artisan exemplified how the village's new supernatural alliance had affected everyone. The community covenant seemed to enhance not just her healing abilities, but every form of constructive work undertaken with genuine intent to help others. Her next stop was the expanded cottage that served as both her home and the region's primary healing center. Pilgrims arrived weekly, seeking treatment for ailments that other healers couldn't address, drawn by stories of miraculous recoveries and medicines that worked with unprecedented effectiveness. Inside, she found Isla tending to a merchant's daughter, whose persistent fever had resisted all conventional treatments. The young mother had become Maeryn's informal apprentice, showing remarkable aptitude for healing work that seemed enhanced by the same supernatural influence that affected all beneficial activities in the village. The fever broke during the night, Isla reported quietly. Her color is returning, and she asked for food this morning for the first time in a week. Maeryn examined the child and confirmed the improvement. The healing had progressed faster than medical knowledge suggested possible, but she'd grown accustomed to such accelerated recoveries. The community covenant somehow channeled collective good intention into tangible results that benefited everyone involved. As afternoon approached, she made her way to the forest's edge for her daily meeting with Varrik. Their relationship had deepened over the months into something that transcended the supernatural circumstances of their first encounter. What had begun as protector and protected had evolved into true partnership based on mutual respect and growing love. She found him in the grove where they'd first shared their stories, sitting beside the new crystal formation that had emerged from the shattered binding stone. The new covenant stone, as villagers called it, glowed with gentle light that reflected the community's combined intention to maintain their supernatural alliance. "The harvest celebrations begin tonight," she told him, settling beside him on the soft grass. "The village council formally invited you to attend." His silver eyes brightened with pleasure. "Public acceptance still surprises me, even after a year. For centuries I existed in shadow and secrecy. This openness feels like a gift I never expected to receive." The transformation in Varrik had been as remarkable as the village's own evolution. Where once he'd struggled against vampiric hunger and predatory instincts, now he radiated contentment that came from purpose freely chosen rather than magically compelled. His supernatural nature remained, but it served conscious intention rather than binding obligation. "There's something else," Maeryn said, reaching into her herb pouch to withdraw a small object wrapped in soft cloth. "Something I've been meaning to give you." She unwrapped a silver ring, not ornate, but finely crafted with intricate engravings that seemed to shift in the light. "Aldrich made this years ago as a practice piece. I've been saving it for someone special." Varrik accepted the ring with reverence that suggested he understood its significance. When he slipped it onto his finger beside the oath ring that still manifested during his protective duties, both bands glowed with harmonious light. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" he said softly. "I'm asking if you'd like to spend whatever time we have, whether that's decades or centuries, building a life together based on choice rather than supernatural obligation." His answer came as a kiss that carried all the tenderness and passion that had grown between them over months of shared purpose and deepening connection. When they separated, both rings blazed briefly with light that seemed to echo through the crystal formation and into the village beyond. That evening, the harvest celebration transformed the village square into a festival ground where lanterns cast warm light over tables laden with food and drink. For the first time in his long existence, Varrik joined a human community as honored guest rather than hidden protector. Elder Thomas raised the first toast. To new traditions that honor the best of old wisdom while embracing innovation that serves everyone's needs. Young Kyle, now the village's deputy smith and a respected member of the community, offered the second. To second chances and the power of confession to transform guilt into purpose. As the evening progressed, Maeryn found herself reflecting on how violence and betrayal had ultimately led to healing and unity that strengthened everyone involved. The attack that had seemed like devastating tragedy had awakened forces that protected not just her, but everyone willing to stand together in mutual support. She watched Varrik teaching village children traditional dances from centuries past, his patient instruction creating laughter and joy that would have been impossible when fear and suspicion ruled community interactions. The former monster had become beloved teacher and protector, while she had evolved from isolated healer into the heart of a network that extended healing influence throughout the region. As midnight approached and the celebration wound down, they walked together toward her cottage under stars that seemed unusually bright. The forest around them hummed with contentment, as if the very trees approved of the harmony that had replaced ancient patterns of sacrifice and obligation. "Do you ever regret the choice we made?" she asked as they reached her door. "Never," he replied without hesitation. "Love freely given and received is worth more than any power maintained through compulsion or sacrifice." Inside her cottage, their cottage now, they settled beside the fire that always burned warmly since the Covenant's establishment. The silver rings on both their hands caught the light, reminding them of promises made not through magical binding, but through conscious choice to build something better together than either could achieve alone.